Many Canadians are just over the mainstream media. They want to defund the CBC, they want to cancel the Toronto Star, because quite frankly, they have no more use for it. But is that really true? Today, we're going to look at what is the role of the mainstream media in today's new information ecosystem. Is it still relevant, or should it go the way of the dodo? So the reason why the mainstream media doesn't seem to be as popular anymore is because people simply don't trust it. So maybe we can break it down for our listeners today. What does this new dynamic look like?
Yeah, well, if we look at the incumbent media, what they're really good at is being present at the time of a news breaking story. So they have the resources to get those reporters to capture the news as it happens. Where the independents really shine is in how they're interpreting the news. In my opinion, there's a big distinguishing factor with traditional news media, which is a lot more clinical in how they approach the news. It doesn't have the same emotional hooks. It doesn't try to immerse itself into bringing meaning, personal meaning to that bit of news.
One of the concerns expressed about the mainstream media is that it's biased, that you're not getting honest reporting or true reporting. But when it gets interpreted by whoever podcaster, YouTuber, TikToker, how they interpret it is very much going to be through their personal lens, their worldview. If you want to take the fact that mainstream media bias as a fact, there's also then that interpretation that the newsfluencers add is another level of bias that's being added on top of it.
Well, I mean, every human is almost by definition always biased. You can't live outside of the bias. I suspect a lot of the accusations for bias of mainstream media comes not from the tenor of the talking points, but rather the selection of the topics. So if you take, for example, the national debate on trans rights, I think a lot of the right wing influencers, what they were complaining about is that every third story on CBC was about trans, and inside the report itself, there was a strong bias. So I suspect that's plays for a lot of it, just not enough stories that they want and too many stories that they don't want.
I think it's a combination. And I say this from my own experience, having been a spokesperson for 15, 20 years, that it is fairly common for journalists to have already decided what the story is. So they are required to represent both sides of the story. So if they're going to write a story about, let's say, an individual or a company or organization, they always have to come and approach that individual company or organization to comment on whatever it is that their news that they're writing about. But the bias that I used to see is that they would come after already had decided what the story is. So they've already pretty much written it and they've just saved a slot for a quote from whoever they're writing about. To me, that is a bias as well that was very prevalent in media that I experienced all the time. It didn't matter in the world. This happened a lot.
I think that's true to a point. Everybody comes in with their own bias. In a previous episode of Spin Nation, we looked at the differences in coverage for immigration, for example, and we saw that this was a huge issue on the right, and they discussed this. I think the statistic was high 40 or 60% of episodes actually touched on immigration, something large like this that was not reflected at all in incumbent media or in left leaning independent voices. So like each group has a certain set of topics that they enjoy covering, and that is not reflected when they look at media and media content that's coming from the other side of the aisle. And I think that gets conflated into bias, but the reality is the choice of topics are very different.
That's a good point. I want to talk a little bit more around how the differences in the way that they operate, the different layering of communication that we see between incumbent media and independents. And that is where they place the audience in their storytelling. So this is really interesting. So if you look and analyze the way traditional media tells the story, puts out the article, does their broadcast piece about what's happening in the news of the day, when you're watching that as the audience, it's being told to you as, blah, 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 XYZ happened to person ABC or
Very
country.
clinical.
You're not part of that story. It's not really communicated how it impacts you. Sometimes they will do coverage specifically to say this new law, what does that mean to you as a resident of this province or city? But overall there's a separation between the audience and the event, so they're just observing it from afar. Whereas when you turn to the independent, I would say quite often the news is interpreted to the person who is listening or watching, and it's told to them with them being at the center of the story, so they're participating in the news of the day versus just observing it.
Yeah, that's right. For example, if you take media coverage of the recent break and enter and how this might impact the ability to defend yourself if your house is under attack, well, the traditional media coverage is going to take a very clinical approach to it and saying, this happened and the person defending their house, here they were, and the person who was breaking and entering, here's what they did and here's the weapons they had. So very clinical, interesting for sure. But where the opinion leaders, the way they're going to put it is essentially, but what does that mean if my house is being attacked? Am I going to be able to defend myself? Am I going to be stuck in court for 5 years to just going through the legal wranglings, etc.? So they make it about the audience, they make it about themselves, and by extension, the audience. So it's it becomes a much more relevant and emotional story than the way that traditional media would cover it.
Yeah, and I think this could be why that independents are perceived to be more authentic and real, and why Canadians relate to them better than they are doing to mainstream media at this stage in time. We'll see, maybe this is just a trend. Maybe in 5 years from now, we're going to be looking back and saying, remember the time of the newsfluencers? Well, wasn't that interesting?
Well, we interviewed in our last episode Carmen Wong of the Can't Be Censored podcast. And one of the points that she brought about is traditional media has a very short format in the sense of, we talk about a news item, it's probably between a minute and a half and 3 minutes
And you move on.
versus how the emerging voices on YouTube have the ability to take the time that it takes to cover a story properly and in the amount of detail that they need to.
Is that true though? I'm going to challenge you on that because if you are an independent, number one, nobody's paying your salary. So there's the financial aspect of it. So you probably also have to have a real job. Number two, the algorithm is relentless. So every day you need to be putting out content, 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 content in order to, keep the algorithm favoring you and seeing you as a productive part of it, of putting content out. So I think that's true in podcasting, maybe, but I don't think that's true if you're on different channels all the time.
Think it depends on the channel. On YouTube, my experience is that most of the emerging voices take formats that are somewhere between 12, 18 minutes, something like that. And some do it even longer. They do full on, 1 hour shows, even 90-minute shows. So there's a variety of formats that people are trying out. But that's the idea, right? If you listen to Klaus Kellerman, he's a left leaning, or I would say Carney supporting influencer, and he'll take, an announcement from Mark Carney that is in very policy driven language that nobody understands really. And he takes the time to walk us through it and explain what it means for Canada, what it means for Canadians and individuals even. So, and he'll take on a full 16, 18 minutes each day. He covers a single story and goes into that amount of detail. So I think especially for consumers of content, of news content, that ability to take the time to really tell the story, I think is something that they're looking for and getting less and less of on traditional media as the newsrooms have shrunk and there's not a lot of public affairs shows or longer format shows anymore on regular Canadian television.
So just our last topic on this is, do these new influencers have the reach that we think? So we did a quick analysis of Q1 the amount of content that the incumbent media is putting out on YouTube. So we're really looking at just one channel here. And it dwarfs the amount of content that the indies are able to put out because they don't have teams and budgets. So there was a massive difference. I think it was 82% of the content on YouTube is an incumbents, and then the last 18% is independents. So not fighting on equal footing in terms of volume. Is the volume matter?
So you're right. The volume is a massive difference. We're talking about probably 60,000 videos over the course of these last 3 months produced and published by the incumbent media, and which a lot of it comes from CTV, almost 20,000, and CBC, all grouped together, also in the same range. But the main difference is the level of engagement. So if we look at engagement rates for the independents, it's 5 times as much as the incumbents on a per video basis. So there's a massive discrepancy there. And that's because these audiences are engaged. I think that's the big difference. The incumbent media audiences are more passive. They're just collecting the news, which is very valuable in and of itself. And like I said earlier, an important part of the ecosystem. But where the audiences are really engaged is with the independents, and they're not shy about putting in their opinion. And I suspect the creators behind that use that not just for the algorithm for algorithmic purposes, but also to reinforce which topics to cover and sort of refine what they think Canadians, or at least their particular audience, what they think about the topic. So there's a bit of a recursive loop here happening that makes that relationship, and we talked about trust earlier in the show. Trust is built based on a two-way relationship. You give me something, I give you something back, right? So I think that's where the independents are a lot better at building that trust relationship, because it's a bit of a two-way street. That's not a familiar format for incumbent media.
So let's wrap the so what. And when we think about it from the perspective of, if you are, you know, trying to understand how perception is formed in Canada, how influence is created, the big sort of insight from this is a lot of attention has always been placed on what the mainstream media is covering. That still matters. It's important that the mainstream media is covering the topic in an accurate way. But when it comes to shaping perception, it matters more how the topic is then being interpreted by that independent ecosystem. So when they add on that layer of interpretation, when they frame it for the audience and makes it connect to that's how they're connecting it to the audience, and it's resonating with them. That is the place where true perception is actually being shaped right now. It is not at the mainstream media phase. It is through the lens and the worldview of Canada's growing independent influencer ecosystem.
Right, because they're at the edge of a topic. They're the ones that are helping shape it, especially for these new audiences. In Canada, almost half of the population gets a significant portion of their news from social and other emerging channels. That number is even higher for the younger audiences, those that are, I don't want to say a complete blank slate, but they're the ones that are learning about all these issues and starting to establish their opinions that will follow them for a good portion of their life. So yeah, that's happening online. That's happening, I would argue, in large part through these independent voices that are emerging. Some of them are pure news influencers, but not everybody gets their news or seeks out the news. Another important layer of narrative forming are the legitimization channels. So those would be channels that don't particularly focus on news. They might have guests, they might talk about sports, they might talk about other topics, but
Like
once in a
wellness,
while they'll drop
wellness, right? Like, is that
like wellness, yeah,
yeah?
absolutely. But once in a while, they'll have an opinion that has to do with news, and that's why we call them legitimization, because they reach to an audience that doesn't normally care about the news, or at least enough to seek it out, but they will help form the opinion of those sort of news agnostic audiences. So very important to not forget about those.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would say that most organizations in Canada don't have a lens onto that world.
Yeah. Yeah. To
So,
give an example of this is like
mm,
the Joe Rogan example,
mm.
right? Most of the time, Joe Rogan talks about MMA or whatever, but then once in a while, or more than once in a while, but every other episode, then he'll take on, healthcare or defense or some other political topic, often with somebody who isn't necessarily an expert. He'll talk to humorists, he'll talk to business leaders, etc. But the topics that they cover will end up covering news items, and that to a person that doesn't really follow the news, that's their one source where they're going to get and start forming that opinion from.
All right. So if you're listening and you're worried about the reputation of your organization in any way, shape, or form, then this is a time for you to actually open up and look at where these narratives are shaping. It's not just in traditional media. And if you're waiting for them to hit the news or you're for it to go viral on social, you have missed the boat. So always great to talk about this evolving landscape. Thank you, as always, Emmanuel, for the great chat today.
Thank you, Laurel. And until next time.
Until next time.